The man had no name, no identification, no fingerprints in the records, and almost every label had been removed from his clothing. The investigators found something that should have made the case easier. A tiny piece of paper, 2 words, Tamám Shud. Those words led police to a book, and inside that book was a telephone number, and beside it, a strange sequence of letters that looked like a code. For decades, investigators tried to understand what those clues meant. Was it a message, a warning, or simply a coincidence? More than 70 years later, DNA appeared to solve the biggest question of all. The man was believed to be Carl Charles Webb. A name, a face, a life. After decades of searching, the mystery finally had an identity. But there was a problem. The name did not explain the death. The code was still unreadable. And the question that mattered most remained unanswered. Why was Carl Webb there? And what really happened to him? The case did not begin with a mysterious code. It began with a man carrying almost nothing that could identify him. No wallet, no passport, no name, no obvious reason for being there. And yet, the more investigators examined what he had left behind, the stranger the case became. On the morning of December 1st, 1948, 2 trainee jockeys discovered the body of an unidentified man at Somerton Beach in Adelaide, South Australia. He appeared to be around 40 years old. He was well dressed, his clothing was neat, and there was something immediately unusual about it. The labels had been removed from his clothes. Not one label, several. Whoever had done it had taken away some of the simplest clues police normally use to identify a stranger. But that was only the beginning. Investigators searched his pockets. They found cigarettes, matches, chewing gum, 2 combs, a used bus ticket, and an unused train ticket. Ordinary objects, but nothing that revealed his name. No identification, no address, no letter, nothing that immediately connected him to a home, a workplace, or a family. The man had arrived in Adelaide, and somehow seemed to have arrived without a past. Then investigators noticed another detail. The previous day, the man had bought a train ticket, but he never used it. Instead, he bought a bus ticket and took a bus towards Somerton Beach. That meant police could reconstruct at least part of his final movements. But reconstruction is not the same as explanation. They knew where he had been. They still didn't know who he was. And then came the first major problem. The doctors could not establish exactly what had killed him. The post-mortem examination suggested poisoning. But tests for common poisons failed to reveal a clear answer. The medical evidence was frustratingly incomplete. If poison had caused his death, what poison? And how had it disappeared from the evidence? The inquest eventually concluded that the death was unnatural, but the evidence was not strong enough to explain exactly what had happened. The investigation was left without the one thing it needed most, a name. Then, police found something they could not ignore. Several months after the man's death, a tiny rolled piece of paper was discovered hidden inside a small pocket of his trousers. On it were 2 words, Tamám Shud. The words were Persian. They roughly meant the end. At first, they could have been nothing more than a fragment from a book. But investigators discovered where the words had come from. They had been torn from the final page of a copy of the Rubáiyát of Omar Khayyám. And suddenly, the case became much stranger. Because now, there was a book, a missing page, a mysterious stranger, and a message that appeared to say, the end. Was it a personal message, a coincidence, A deliberate clue? Or something placed there by someone who wanted investigators to find it? Even the detectives disagreed. One investigator believed the words could support the possibility of suicide. Another warned that the same piece of paper could have been placed there by someone else. The evidence pointed in different directions, and that was becoming the defining feature of the case. Every clue seemed to answer one question while creating another. But the strangest discovery was still waiting. Police eventually received the copy of the Rubáiyát from which the final words had been torn. And inside, there was something even more intriguing. A sequence of letters, a possible code, and a telephone number. The number belonged to a woman who lived surprisingly close to the place where the unidentified man had been found. Now investigators had something new to investigate. A dead man with no name, a torn page, a book, a possible code, a telephone number, and a woman who appeared to have some connection to the mystery. For police in 1949, this should have been the breakthrough. Instead, it created another layer of questions. Who had written the letters? What did they mean? Why was the number there? And most importantly, what was the connection between this unidentified man and the people surrounding the book? The case was no longer simply about identifying a body. It had become a puzzle, and investigators were about to discover that some puzzles become more complicated the closer you get to the answer. The police had a dead man. They had no name, and now they had a message. But the message raised a more disturbing possibility. What if Tamám Shud had not been left there by accident? The phrase had been torn from the final page of the Rubáiyát of Omar Khayyám. So investigators began searching for the missing book. They eventually found it. A man handed a copy to police after saying it had been left in the back of his car around the time the body was discovered. There was one detail that immediately stood out. The final page was missing. The exact page containing the words Tamám Shud. That meant the tiny piece of paper found on the dead man had come from this particular copy. The connection was real, but what did it mean? The police examined the book more closely, and then they found something else. On the back pages were faint handwritten marks, a sequence of letters, lines of apparently meaningless characters. At first glance, it looked like a code. And if it was a code, someone had written it for a reason. For decades, people would argue about what those letters meant. A secret message, a cipher, a set of initials, or simply a random written that investigators had mistaken for something more mysterious. No one was able to prove it. But there was another clue, a telephone number. Police traced it to a young woman living only a short distance from where the body had been found. Her name was Jessie Thompson. She was also known as Jo, and later became one of the most intriguing figures connected to the case. Police questioned her. She denied knowing the unidentified man. But there was a strange coincidence. She had once owned a copy of the Rubáiyát herself, and now a book connected to a dead stranger contained her telephone number. Was she connected to him? Was the number simply a coincidence? Or had the dead man known something about her? Investigators had no definitive answer, and that was becoming a pattern. The clues were real. The connections were real. But the meaning behind them remained impossible to prove. Then the investigators faced an even bigger problem. The strange letters in the book looked like a code, but nobody could crack it. And without knowing whether the letters were actually a message, the entire theory remained uncertain. The book had given police their most fascinating clues. It had also given them their biggest unanswered questions, and somewhere inside those questions was the possibility that the man on the beach had not been as anonymous as he first appeared. The book had given investigators something they desperately needed: a possible connection, a possible message, and a possible code. But none of it fit together cleanly. The handwritten letters found inside the book looked like a cipher. For decades, people would try to decipher them. Some saw a secret message, others saw evidence of espionage, but no reliable method ever proved that the letters were actually a coded communication. Then there was the telephone number. It belonged to a woman named Jessica Thompson, also known by the names Joe and Justin. She lived only a short distance from where the unidentified man had been found. That was not proof of anything, but it was enough to make investigators ask a very obvious question. Why was her number written inside the book? Police interviewed her. She acknowledged that she had once owned a copy of the Rubáiyát of Omar Khayyám, but she denied knowing the unidentified man. Investigators still wanted to know whether she might recognize him, so they showed her a plaster bust reconstructed from his head and shoulders. According to later accounts, her reaction attracted attention, but she never provided an explanation that solved the mystery. And now the case had another contradiction: a mysterious man, a mysterious book, a possible code, and a woman's telephone number. Each clue appeared meaningful, but none could be connected with certainty. Then investigators returned to the man's belongings. Some clothing labels had been removed. That detail had always been suspicious. But there was another name. The word Keen appeared on some of the clothing. For decades, nobody knew why. Was it the man's name, someone else's, or simply a previous owner's mark? Much later, researchers proposed a possible explanation involving Carl Webb's family. But even that clue did not explain the circumstances of the man's death. And this is where the investigation became difficult, because the case contained plenty of clues, but very little certainty. The police could prove that the paper existed. They could trace it to the book. They could confirm the telephone number. They could document the strange letters. They could examine the clothing. But they could not prove the story connecting all those pieces. And without that connection, the most exciting theories remained theories. The idea of spy became especially popular. A man without identity, labels removed from his clothing, a mysterious code, an unexplained death. It sounded convincing, almost too convincing. But investigators had a problem. There was no classified document, no intelligence file, no verified message, no physical evidence proving espionage. The spy theory explained the mystery, but the evidence never proved the theory. And then another possibility began to emerge. Maybe the strangest clue in the entire case wasn't a code. Maybe it was the man himself. Because if investigators could discover who he really was, they might finally understand why all the other clues existed. And for decades, that question remained out of reach. For decades, the Somerton Man had no name. Then investigators made the discovery that changed the case. Not in a police life, not in confession, not in the mysterious code. In his DNA, the breakthrough began with something remarkably small: a hair. It had been preserved in a plaster bust made from the man's head shortly after his death. More than 70 years later, researchers were able to extract DNA from that material, and the result was extraordinary. The sample produced millions of genetic markers. Researchers then turned to forensic genealogy. Instead of searching for the man's name directly, they searched for his relatives. Thousands of possible connections appeared, but most could be eliminated. Wrong age, wrong family, wrong circumstances. Until one name began to stand out. Carl Webb, born in Victoria, an electrical engineer and an instrument maker. A man who appeared to have disappeared from the records after 1947, and then another clue suddenly looked different. The name Keen had been found on some of the Somerton Man's clothing. Researchers discovered that Carl Webb had a family connection to someone named John Keen. A coincidence? Possibly, but now the investigation had something it had never had before. A candidate, a real person, a family tree, and DNA that could be tested against living relatives. Researchers followed the family line, looking for someone who could provide a genetic comparison. Eventually, they found one. The DNA matched, and suddenly, the impossible question had an answer. The man known for decades as the Somerton Man was believed to be Carl Charles Webb. After 74 years, the mystery of his identity appeared to be solved. But this was not the end. It was the beginning of a much harder investigation. Because a name could tell them who he was, it could not tell them why he died. And it could not explain why he had traveled to Adelaide, why he had no identification, why the labels had been removed, why his clothing contained the name Keen, or what the strange letters in the book actually meant. The DNA had solved the identity, but it had left the mystery itself almost untouched. And now, investigators had to ask a completely different question. Not who was the Somerton Man, but what happened to Carl Webb? Finding a name should have solved the mystery. Instead, it created a new one. Carl Charles Webb was not a fictional identity. He was a real man, born in Melbourne in 1905, an electrical engineer and instrument maker. He had a family, he had a wife, he had a profession, he had a life. So how could a man with a real identity end up being remembered for more than 70 years as someone nobody could name? Researchers began reconstructing the life that existed before the beach, and one detail quickly became important. Webb's marriage had broken down. His wife Dorothy eventually left him. The couple separated, and records suggested that Webb had disappeared from his family's world around the same period in which the Somerton mystery began. But there was still a problem. There was no simple trail leading from Melbourne to Adelaide to Somerton Beach. No confirmed journey, no clear reason for the trip, no final letter explaining where he was going, and no definitive record explaining what happened during his final days. The new identity solved one mystery, but it did not solve the timeline. Then researchers returned to one of the strangest pieces of evidence, the name Keen. For decades, it looked like another possible identity, but the new investigation suggested something different. Webb had a nephew named John Keen, who had died during the Second World War. Researchers proposed that some of the clothing marked with the name Keen may have belonged to that relative. If that explanation is correct, one of the case's most mysterious clues suddenly becomes much less mysterious. But notice what happened. One clue disappeared. And the bigger mystery remained, because the question was never only who was the man, it was why did he die in Somerton? And that question became even harder after investigators considered the medical evidence. The original examination could not establish a clear cause of death. There was signs suggesting poisoning, but the specific substance was never conclusively identified. And because so much time had passed, modern investigators faced an enormous limitation. The body had been buried for decades. In 2021, South Australian authorities exhumed the remains in the hope that modern DNA technology could finally identify him. It worked, but DNA is very good at answering one kind of question: who does this person belong to? It is much less useful for answering what happened to him. By 2026, South Australia police were still conducting a coronial investigation. Police said the investigation remained complex and ongoing. A report was expected to be provided to the coroner, who would then decide whether further proceedings were necessary. And that leaves us with something extraordinary. After more than 7 decades, we may finally know the man's name. But we still don't know the complete story of his final journey. We don't know exactly why he came to Adelaide. We don't know what brought him to Somerton. And we still don't have a definitive explanation for his death. The mystery changed. It didn't disappear. It simply became a different mystery. And now, there is one question left to investigate. What was Carl Webb doing in Adelaide in the first place? The name was finally there, Carl Charles Webb. But a name is not a timeline, and investigators still had to answer the most basic question: how did Webb end up in Adelaide? The surviving evidence gives us pieces, not a complete journey, pieces. His marriage had broken down. His wife Dorothy eventually divorced him on the grounds of desertion in 1951. And researchers believe Webb had effectively disappeared from his family's world around the period before his death. But there is no confirmed record explaining why he traveled to South Australia. No final letter, no verified itinerary, no message saying where he was going, and no document explaining why his journey ended at Somerton Beach. Then there is the suitcase. It had been checked into the cloakroom at Adelaide railway station the day before the body was discovered. Inside were clothes and personal items believed to belong to him. Some labels had been removed. Others carried the name Keen or Keen. There was also a particular type of waxed thread that researchers connected with repairs to the trousers he was wearing. For years, even the name Keen seemed like another mystery. But researchers later proposed a possible explanation. Carl Webb had a nephew named John Keen, who had died during the Second World War. The theory is that Webb may have inherited some of his relatives' clothing. If that's correct, then one of the strangest clues in the entire case may have an ordinary explanation. But notice what happens again. One mystery becomes smaller, while the central mystery remains. Because even if we explain the clothes, we still don't know why Webb was in Adelaide, and we still don't know what happened to him. The medical evidence doesn't give us an easy answer either. The original coroner concluded that the death resulted from poisoning, but the specific poison was never identified. There were no obvious signs of violence. And decades later, researchers have said that the passage of more than 70 years makes determining the precise cause of death extremely difficult. Then there is the code. The letters found inside the Rubáiyát remain one of the most famous pieces of evidence in the case. But no reliable decipherment has established that they were actually a secret message. That distinction matters. A mysterious-looking sequence is not automatically a code, and an unexplained clue is not automatically evidence of espionage. The same problem follows almost every theory surrounding the case. There is enough evidence to ask the question, but not enough evidence to prove the answer. And today, the investigation has entered an unusual final stage. Researchers believe the man was Carl Charles Webb. DNA evidence strongly supports that identification. Family photographs and historical records provide additional corroboration, but South Australian police had still not formally completed their colonial investigation as of July 2026. Police described the investigation as complex and ongoing, with a report to be provided to the coroner. So after all these years, we are left with something almost paradoxical. The man who spent decades without a name may finally have one, Carl Charles Webb. But knowing his name doesn't tell us why he died. It doesn't explain every clue, and it doesn't reveal what happened during his final journey. The identity mystery may be nearly solved, but the death mystery isn't. And that brings us to the question that has survived everything else. Was the Somerton Man ever really a mystery about his identity? Or was his identity simply the first mystery we were able to solve? For 78 years, the Somerton Man had been a question without a name. Now, he has one, Carl Charles Webb. But the strange thing about solving an old mystery is that sometimes the answer doesn't close the case. It opens a new one. Because the DNA evidence may have brought us remarkably close to identifying the man, but it cannot tell us why he traveled to Adelaide. It cannot tell us what happened during his final days, and it cannot explain the mysterious letters found inside the Rubáiyát. Even the famous name, Keen, now appears to have a more ordinary explanation. Researchers believe Webb may have been wearing clothing that once belonged to his nephew, John Keen, who died during the Second World War. One of the great clues may have been nothing more than a family connection, and that changed the way we look at the entire case. Perhaps the mystery was never as elaborate as people imagined. Perhaps there was no spy, no secret mission, no hidden organization. Perhaps a series of ordinary events became extraordinary because one crucial fact was missing, the man's name. But there is still something investigators cannot simply explain away: the circumstances of his death. More than 70 years later, the precise cause remains uncertain, and the South Australian police are still conducting their coronial investigation. As of July 2026, police said the investigation remained complex and ongoing, with a report to be provided to the coroner. That means the story is not officially finished, and perhaps it never will be. Because even the coroner confirms the identity, one question may remain beyond the reach of modern science. Why was Carl Webb in Adelaide? Was he traveling? Was he trying to disappear? Was something happening in his personal life? Or was his death simply the tragic end of a journey whose beginning we can no longer find? We have photographs, we have family records, we have DNA, we have the book, the paper, the code, the clothes, the suitcase, decades of police work, and now a name. But when all those pieces are placed on the table, there is still a gap in the middle. And perhaps that is what makes the Somerton Man so difficult to forget. The mystery is no longer who was he. it is something much harder. What happened to him? And after all these years, we still don't know. For 78 years, he was known as the Somerton Man, a man without a name, a man surrounded by clues, but separated from the truth. Now, we may finally know who he was, Carl Charles Webb. But a name is not an explanation. We still don't know exactly why he came to Adelaide. We don't know what happened during his final days. We still don't know what the strange letters in the book really meant. Perhaps some of those mysteries have ordinary explanations. Perhaps others never will. But that's what makes this case so remarkable. For decades, investigators were searching for a name, and when technology finally gave them one, they discovered that the name was only the beginning, because sometimes solving a mystery doesn't give you the answer. It simply tells you which question to ask next. The Somerton Man may finally have a name, but his final story is still waiting to be told. And perhaps, somewhere in the evidence, the last answer is still there. Reality has built-in errors.